Welcome to This Week Explained, the podcast that helps you make sense of the complexities of our ever-changing world. I'm Tiana, and each week, alongside my co-host Kervin, we break down the biggest global events and explain how they might impact you. This week, we're covering the ongoing wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, a crisis in Africa, communication cables being cut in the Indo-Pacific and the Baltic Sea, and a powder keg on the southern United States border. Let's start with the latest updates on the war in Ukraine. The EU has just extended sanctions on Russia for another 6 months. So what's the significance of this move, and what does it mean for the ongoing conflict?
Well, look, the EU's decision to roll over these sanctions is a clear signal that they remain committed to pressuring Russia, at least economically. And these sanctions target critical sectors like the industry, energy, technology, finance, even luxury goods are being sanctioned. Now, the goal here is to deprive Moscow of the resources it needs to sustain its war effort in Ukraine. But what's interesting is that the renewal of sanctions requires unanimous approval from all 27 EU member states. And Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, we've talked about plenty of times on this podcast, has been vocal about his opposition to sanctions against Russia. Now, that initially cast doubt on any renewal of these sanctions, but in the end, Orban dropped his veto, or the threat of veto, and he allowed these sanctions to move forward.
So it sounds like the EU is staying united for now, but how effective are these sanctions in actually impacting Russia's ability to wage war?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I routinely talk about how sanctions are dumb. They don't really do anything. But it's clear that these sanctions have actually hurt Russia's economy, and it's particularly in areas like energy exports and then access to advanced technology. But they haven't been enough to stop this war in Ukraine. Russia has found ways to adapt. They've deepened its economic ties with countries like China and India. And so while the sanctions are a tool to weaken Moscow, they're just not enough to do any significant damage.
Speaking of Moscow, there's news that Russian forces have claimed control of a key town in Ukraine's Donetsk region. So what's the strategic importance of this town?
Look, it's significant because it's a defensive hub for the Ukrainian army. It's located on the front lines in the Donetsk region, and this has been a focal point of Russia's offensive for over a year now. This is a major gain for them, and it's because there's talks of a negotiated peace deal on the horizon, and the capture of this town could open up new opportunities for Russian forces to advance even further.
But Ukrainian forces haven't completely given up the fight there, right?
Yeah, so the 110th Separate Mechanized Brigade, that's the unit that's active in that area, confirmed that they have withdrawn from certain parts of the town because they wanted to avoid encirclement. But they emphasized that fighting is still ongoing in that region. So their strategy seems to be minimizing losses while using natural obstacles. There's a nearby river there that they've been using that's slowing the Russian advance. So it's a tactical retreat, not a full surrender of the area.
Well, it sounds like a tough situation for Ukrainian troops. So what challenges are they facing on the ground?
The biggest challenge is manpower. Ukrainian forces are roughly equal to the Russians in terms of artillery and drones, thanks to the U.S. and NATO. But Russia has a significant advantage in sheer numbers. That's sheer manpower. Ukrainian soldiers have described the situation as quite difficult, and they've called for more weapons from NATO to counter Russian aggression.
And that brings us to the broader geopolitical picture. There's been talk of a potential meeting between President Putin and President Trump. So what is the latest on that?
Yeah, look, the Kremlin has said it's ready to arrange a meeting, but so far, they haven't received any signals from the United States. Both Putin and Trump have expressed publicly there's an interest in meeting, with Putin wanting to discuss the Ukraine war and energy prices. Now, Trump, who recently took office, as we all know, he's called the war, this is his quote, ridiculous. I think I've used that quote as well. Putin's, movement again over the border, that was ridiculous. And Trump has said he wants an end to this war. but it seems like it's going to take some time to set up any formal talks between the two leaders.
Well, do you think that a meeting like this could lead to any meaningful progress?
Look, it's unlikely to lead to any meaningful progress. Trump's approach to foreign policy has always been transactional. It's heavily influenced by domestic political considerations and his base, who keeps him elected and in office. So while he may be, he's probably frustrated with Putin's actions, he also needs to appeal to a base, a voting base that is increasingly skeptical of U.S. aid to Ukraine. They're also critical of Zelensky. This creates a very delicate balancing act for Trump, because taking a hardline stance against Russia could alienate his supporters, but then appearing too conciliatory towards Putin might alienate moderates who really did get him elected this election cycle. Now, the reality is that no meaningful agreement can be reached without Ukraine coming to the table. And Zelensky's been very clear. Any negotiations have to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. That directly conflicts with Russia's demands. So without a significant shift on the battlefield, whether that's a decisive Ukrainian victory or a major Russian breakthrough, neither of those sides are likely to feel enough pressure to compromise on these issues.
Obviously, this is an extremely complex situation. So, before we wrap up talking about the war in Ukraine, what should listeners keep an eye on in the coming weeks?
I'd say watch for developments in the Donetsk region, because if Russia consolidates its control there, that's going to shift the dynamics on the ground. And that could lead to Ukraine being forced to negotiate on Russia's terms, which I believe that's going to embolden Putin to be more aggressive in the near future. Now, it's unlikely Putin makes another move for Kyiv before a peace deal is signed. But once that does happen, and if it's favorable to Russia's goals for controlling the eastern part of Ukraine, we're going to see Russia consolidate its forces in those annexed regions and then make that move for Kyiv within a few years.
Within a few years of the peace talks or whatever?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. Yeah, within a few years of that peace deal being signed.
Yeah.
So the war stops and Russia will consolidate their forces, but now they've moved their border closer to Kyiv. So now those troops move into those annexed regions.
So they'll get to start the next invasion closer to their goal.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
And they've got lessons learned from the last time they attempted a move on Kyiv, so they're not going to make that same mistake.
All right, well, now let's shift to Gaza, where tens of thousands of Palestinians have begun returning to their homes after months of displacement. This comes after a ceasefire agreement in the 15-month-long war between Israel and Hamas. So can you give us some context on what's happening there?
Yes, so the ceasefire agreement has allowed displaced Palestinians to return to northern Gaza, and we all know northern Gaza was heavily bombed during this conflict.
So do you have a sense of the mood of the returning Palestinians?
Well, I'm sure, as most people can guess, it's a mix of hope and dread. Many are relieved to be going back to their homes, but they're also fearful of what actually remains of their homes. The entire neighborhoods in Gaza have been reduced to rubble, and the Hamas-run Gaza government says that they're going to need at least 135,000 tents and shelters to accommodate those returning. Now, people are determined in Gaza, though. Some are saying they're never going to leave Gaza City again. That's even if Israel sends one tank for every resident of Gaza. And this was, I know, your concern always, Tiana, that the absolute devastating effects of this conflict on the people of Gaza, that's going to embolden a new generation of fighters, not just against the Israeli state, but also against Western allies to Israel.
Okay, so what about the ceasefire itself? I mean, we talked at length last week that the ceasefire was teetering on the brink of failure. So is it currently holding?
Well, for now, yeah, the situation is holding, but it's incredibly fragile. There have already been reports of violence, including an Israeli missile strike that killed the Palestinian bulldozer driver. Now, Israel says it's targeting threats and enforcing the terms of the agreement. That includes restrictions on movement in certain areas. At the same time, Israel has made it clear that the IDF is going to remain in Jenin. That's a move that could easily reignite tensions in the region. On the other side, Hamas isn't doing much to maintain the peace either. They're scrambling to reframe the tragic deaths of hostages who actually died in captivity as being a result of IDF actions. And that only adds more fuel to an already volatile situation.
So was it in the ceasefire agreement that the IDF gets to remain in Jenin? Or are
So
they
there was
just taking liberty with what was in the ceasefire?
there's no actual verbiage about the West Bank. It's really just Gaza. The IDF has to remove themselves from Gaza so that people can come back, and they have to allow international aid. So what's going on here is the IDF is seeing, well, there's no mention of the West Bank and other regions close to the Israeli border, so they're going to put forces there for what they say is to keep an eye on Hamas, make sure they're not reestablishing their forces. But what Palestinians are saying is a power grab by Israel to kind of remain active in that region.
Okay, well, for now, let's shift gears slightly. There's been some intriguing and frankly concerning commentary coming from Hamas leadership about the future of Gaza. So, can you elaborate on what they've been saying, particularly in terms of their vision for governance, their relationship with other regional powers, and how they see Gaza's role in the broader conflict moving forward? What should we be paying attention to in their rhetoric and their actions right now?
Yeah, well, senior Hamas officials actually gave an interesting interview to Saudi Arabia's Al Arabiya news outlet. And that's where they suggested that Hamas isn't necessarily looking to govern Gaza after the war. They acknowledge that any future governance of Gaza is going to require both regional and international support. And they specifically mentioned Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas as part of that equation. That's a shift in what they used to say before this conflict began. In fact, there's been an agreement between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority's Fatah party to form a joint committee to oversee post-war Gaza. Now, this committee would focus on critical areas like health, education, and reconstruction, and it's a notable shift in rhetoric from Hamas. But it remains to be seen how this is going to play out in practice. That's especially true given the long-standing tensions between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. So it raises questions about whether this is a genuine step toward unity or more of a strategic move to secure international legitimacy and aid for rebuilding Gaza. And that would mean there would be more time for Hamas to regroup.
I mean, that would be a significant shift if Hamas is being honest about their intentions. But do you think Israel would be willing to agree to such a plan?
That's highly unlikely. Israel's made it clear that it opposes any role for Hamas in Gaza, and it also doesn't trust the Palestinian Authority to govern effectively. Now, Hamas, for its part, has dismissed Israel's stance, and they're open to negotiating Gaza's future with other parties, including the United States. Very interesting. Abu Marzouk, he's a senior Hamas official. He praised Donald Trump for his role in getting the ceasefire deal done and the hostage negotiations. Within that same breath, he then criticized Trump's suggestion to displace Gaza's population to countries like Jordan and Egypt, and Hamas called it unacceptable.
I mean, honestly, that's not cool of him to suggest that, to be honest. I understand. Yeah, we'll just send them to Jordan and Egypt and take them out of their homeland. That's cool. We'll just do that because that's super easy and not going to be more traumatizing to those people at all. It's fine.
It all goes back to Trumpism, right? Or Trumperboly. He just says stuff in public.
Yeah.
He's
Oh,
not
I
your
know.
typical president.
Oh, I've watched a lot of his press conference today because of the plane crash that happened at DCA, and he is just shooting off at the mouth. It's astounding the things that he was implying. I mean, obviously that's not what we're talking about right here. So
But
let me bring it back. Huh?
Oh, I
Or we
said well, that while that was a tragedy as well, but he did that for COVID too. Remember the put bleach in their veins, and he would just say things,
yeah.
and it was like a comedian that was trying to, you know, you know, shop certain jokes. And so Trump is like, "Oh, let me workshop this. Can we put bleach in people's veins?" And
Oh, yeah, I
yeah,
do remember all that. Anyways, like I said, I'm trying to bring it back, and you went off to COVID for some
uh,
reason. Okay.
yeah, I'm back in 2020.
Oh, get out of there. Get
Yeah.
out. Okay. So, what do you think this means for the future of Gaza and the broader region?
Look, the ceasefire and the return of displaced Palestinians are a step in the right direction. The core issues, though, are still far from resolved. Now, one of the biggest questions right now is who's going to govern Gaza moving forward? That's going to require cooperation from multiple stakeholders. The problem, though, is that there is still a lot of deep mistrust between Israel, Hamas, but also the Palestinian Authority. So until that mistrust is addressed, if it ever can be addressed, we're likely to see conflicts like the one that started in October 2023 continue to flare up in the Middle East.
Well, we will obviously continue to follow the situation in Gaza as we have been doing every week since this conflict has started. But now let's get into a topic that's been simmering for years but is reaching a boiling point. The African continent, particularly the Sahel region, has become a powder keg of violence, instability, and power struggles. And with Western backed forces like the US and France pulling out, and Russian backed groups like Wagner stepping in, it's creating a dangerous vacuum. So let's start with the basics here. What is happening in Africa right now that has you, sorry, so concerned?
Well, seeing as you know personally in our family, we lived through this situation for a few years. I worked counterterrorism on the
I'm not
continent.
gonna say I'm not gonna say I lived through it. You were the one
Eh,
working in
I would
Africa.
disagree.
Well, I was perfectly fine in my safe little house with my three kids eating ice cream for dinner whenever I wanted. So I wouldn't say I lived through it.
I always I always said that it was easier for me to be in those areas which sounded counterintuitive because it was like, wait, you're in a very dangerous area, like, you know, I don't know, Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, where a coup kind of flared up while I was there. I felt safer and would have been more concerned if the roles were reversed because you had no idea what was going on. You were at home going, is I think that he's safe, but I don't really know that he's safe.
Well, that's the nature of the game. Like your
Yeah,
job has always had a level of what's the word? Confidentiality to it.
yeah,
I'm not allowed to be privy to a lot of the details, which, fine. So I've come to terms with that ages ago. And you always come home safe. You might have a story to tell and you might not. I mean, it depends. And sometimes I don't find out things until years later when something triggers your brain and you're like, oh, this happened, blah, 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 blah. But I don't press for anything out of you. And I respect the limits of what you can tell me. So, I mean, like I said, I've come to terms with it. I felt safe. And even whenever you were going through what happened in Africa, I chose to believe everything was okay, you know?
yeah,
And so, I mean, I had to, or I would have gone nuts. I mean, we had three little babies at that point in time. And if I started losing it, the kids would have felt it immediately. And I didn't want that to be on them. So I had to keep a stuff together.
and that's what I'm saying. That takes a mental toll on you. So you did live through that
I don't know.
that situation. You're just I just
Eh,
think you're being a little too humble
I'm not.
into
Oh, I'm not humble. Just
stop it. Well, I
just
mean,
kidding.
everybody's listening to this conversation. Now you understand that this region has never been the most stable region. It, I will say, though, it does really feel like things are unraveling more and more every single day. And that's especially true now that Russian forces have stepped into the African continent.
I mean, it does seem like the situation is deteriorating rather quickly. I've seen a major influx in articles on news sites that are discussing all the instability that's occurring on the African continent right now. So, what do you think is driving this?
Look, a lot of it comes down to the surge in violence from jihadist groups like affiliates from Al Qaeda, the Islamic State, and also Boko Haram. These groups are taking advantage of weak governance, porous borders, Burkina Faso and Mali being a very porous border. As you know, I have a very hilarious story about crossing the border between Burkina Faso and Mali. Um, and then also the withdrawal of Western forces that is actually helping those jihadist groups expand their influence.
I mean, that makes sense because that was part of the reason why they were there to begin with, or, anti terrorism.
Yep.
So, obviously, this is a dangerous combination of factors at play here. So, are there any specific examples of how this is playing out?
Yeah, so look, Nigeria is a prime example of this. The military there is stretched incredibly thin, and they're not just fighting one insurgency. They're dealing with four.
Did you say four insurgencies
Yeah.
at all at once? I mean,
Yep.
that is a lot for any military to handle, much less one in a poor country in Africa that doesn't have a lot of assets or resources at their disposal. I mean, what the heck, man?
Yeah, and look, it's Nigeria's in the Western Sahel, considered one of the richer countries, but you're exactly right. It's a poor nation, and the money that is coming in is being utilized for the wrong purposes. It goes to government leaders, government officials, business people, but it doesn't go to the military. Like there are a lot of times over the past few years where the Nigerian military wasn't even paid to fight these insurgencies. And that's why they need the US and France and those militaries to come in and help out. And it's not just Nigeria. It is a regional crisis.
So, what do you mean by regional? Are these groups operating across the borders?
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. You got that. They don't respect the borders, is what I'm trying to say. They exploit the borders. Now, the Sahel region in particular is a hotbed for this kind of activity. We've got countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger that are all dealing with similar issues to Nigeria. And with the Western forces of the US and France pulling back, there's this power vacuum that these insurgencies and these terrorist groups are rushing to fill.
So, it's not just Nigeria's military being overwhelmed, it's a broader issue of instability all across the region.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's also the involvement of external players like Russia, which only complicates things further. So it's this perfect storm of weak governance, overstretched militaries, and opportunistic.
So, how do you even begin to address something like that?
Yeah, that is the big question. It's going to take a coordinated effort. That's regional cooperation, international support, but also a focus on addressing the root causes of instability. I will say right now, it feels like the region is heading in the opposite direction of stability.
Did you say the Wagner group is there? Is it present in the area?
Yeah, they've actually been renamed or reestablished in that
Uh-huh.
area. You remember very famously the Wagner leader, Prigozhin,
Yeah.
went and tried a coup in Moscow. He then,
Died in a plane
uh,
crash.
yes, I was trying to say,
Yeah, I know you wanted to say something a little.
sorry.
So what are they doing? That's what my main question is if they're there, what is their purpose? Like, what are
securing the natural resources of Africa because of the sanctions put on Russia, so that Russia can use those natural resources in order to prop up their special military operation in
okay?
Ukraine.
So, what did they tell the countries of Africa they were doing? Like, what was
So
their
there was
reason? Like, how did they manage to convince them to push out America and push out France and allow them to come in and replace them? So, what were they? What did they? What story did they sell?
So this has been my problem with the Biden administration. That's the previous U.S. presidential administration. Uh, During those 4 years that they were in office, they lost the information narrative on in the Western Sahel. Actually, in all the entire Western or the entire African continent. And what I'm saying here is, and this goes for France too, and Macron, can't leave him out of that.
Isn't he leaving office, or did he leave office?
He should leave office.
I
This
thought
isn't a
he
political
announced.
statement. He
Yep.
has really crushed the France.
Okay.
I mean,
Well, we'll get to that.
we'll
Let's
talk.
go.
Yeah, but
Okay.
so there's Russia as well as China did a targeted information campaign within the African continent, and the Biden administration, I can tell you. I won't talk about France because we're not in France, and I'm not reading French news day to day, but I am reading U.S. news day to day, and I'm within the U.S. Intelligence community. So I know that these narratives are being pushed out by the Russian Federation and the Chinese Communist Party, and it is all based on colonialism, and they're using these half-truths of, right, colonialism is bad. Yes, nations should be able to defend themselves, and they should have sovereign borders, but they're using that as a narrative to say, so push them all out and let us, the global South, take that money that you're giving to protect, for security reasons and for national security, so that we can protect you. And oh, by the way, we're going to take these natural resources and ship them out of Africa and send them to our country so we can make more money off of that. That's not the public narrative. That's more of the behind the scenes, what's going on.
You don't think they haven't figured out that it's all BS yet? I guess they're focused on the infighting that's going on. They have bigger fish to fry right now. I don't know.
And you know how we talk about the CCP and Xi Jinping and how
Right.
they offer just enough money to keep you
Complacent.
complacent. Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. To keep you complacent, so that you don't ask questions.
That's funny. I mean, not funny, but they threw around colonialism and, obviously the horrors that were perpetrated upon their nation by the United States, as they are currently technically trying to colonize other people's countries like Taiwan and Ukraine.
The Philippines.
The Philippines. Oh, yeah, the Philippines. I sent you that article today. And then also, they want to establish their Russia wants to establish their borders to their old empire that they had.
A return to the United Soviet States of Russia, right? The USSR.
Right.
That is Putin's goal.
Well, anyway, obviously, all of this is heartbreaking. Africa is once again being taken advantage of, and it would be irresponsible not to address the elephant in the room, which we kind of hit on a little bit earlier, which was the withdrawal of Western forces. And to what extent has their departure exacerbated this crisis? And what are the ripple effects that it's had on the region's stability?
Yeah, I'll just go back to what I said, and I've said this from the very start. The withdrawal of Western forces, and that's particularly the U.S. and France, has absolutely been devastating for the African continent. For years, these countries provided critical support that includes, drones, surveillance, intelligence, and military training. I don't think a lot of people understand that when we go as U.S. service members to these countries, we actually provide military training to their forces. We also provide weapons for those forces to use. So you'll see a lot of M4s and M16s being utilized by these nations, and that is good for their military. The removal of all that has created a massive security vacuum. Without a highly competent intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance apparatus, jihadist groups now operate with far less fear of detection or reprisal. Now, this has emboldened them to launch more daring attacks, like the recent assault on Chad's presidential palace by Boko Haram. And it's a clear sign that these groups feel they can act with impunity.
And now, also, something we mentioned like 5 seconds ago was that Russia is attempting to fill the void left by the West. What does that mean for the region?
Look, it's a double-edged sword. And I always talk about we got to send both sides of the story here. So on one hand, the Wagner group that we talked about, they do provide some security assistance. And that's something that governments desperately need on the African continent. But as we know, their presence often exacerbates instability. These mercenaries are notorious for human rights abuses and for propping up authoritarian regimes. Their involvement doesn't address the root cause of a conflict. It just suppresses that root cause temporarily. For example, in Mali, the government has turned to Wagner forces, but instead of stabilizing the country, their presence has coincided with an increase in violence. So jihadist groups are using this anti-Western narrative that I've talked about to recruit even more fighters. And the lack of accountability for Wagner's actions are actually fueling resentment among the local populations.
So what you're saying is that this isn't solely a matter of security. It's also deeply intertwined with larger geopolitical dynamics and their far-reaching implications.
Absolutely. Russia's involvement is part of a larger strategy to expand its influence in Africa. So by stepping in where the West has now pulled out, Russia's positioning itself as a key player in the region. And this has implications not just for Africa, but for global geopolitics. Now, countries like China and Turkey are also vying for influence, and this is creating a multipolar power struggle.
Okay, so what do you think could be done to stop this?
Look, the international community absolutely needs to re-engage with the region. The U.S. lost the information war during the Biden administration. I just talked about that. I would like to see President Trump take an interest on the continent so that we can help return stability to the region. It's not just about the Western Sahel. It's not even just a broader Africa problem. The consequences of all this bleed over into Western Europe in the form of a migrant crisis that could eventually cause massive disruptions across the globe.
So do you think that the West will step back in, or has the damage already been done?
I mean, the West is facing its own challenges. We got Ukraine, get tensions in the Indo-Pacific, in the Middle East. But the last thing I do want to say on this, and then we can move to the next topic. Ignoring Africa would be a mistake. The Sahel is becoming a breeding ground for terrorism, and the longer the crisis goes unaddressed, the greater the risk to global security.
Well, thank you for that robust update and for sharing your candid insights on that matter. Up next, we're shifting our focus to some fascinating developments beneath seas. But before we dive in, we need to take a quick break for a message from our sponsors. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back, listeners. As we hinted earlier, there's a critical topic that often flies under the radar, but is absolutely essential to the way the modern world operates, which is undersea communication cables. These cables form the backbone of the internet and global data transfer, and it makes them indispensable to our daily lives. However, they're increasingly becoming targets in what experts are referring to as, quote, gray zone warfare, end quote. Carvin, let's start with the fundamentals. Why are these cables so vital?
Well, thank you for the setup there. That was awesome. Um, Undersea cables are the unsung heroes of our connected world. They carry about 95% of all international data, and that includes internet traffic, financial transactions, but also military communications. So without them, the global economy would grind to a halt. They're essentially the arteries of the digital age, and their importance makes them a prime target for nations looking to disrupt or weaken their adversaries.
And we've seen a string of incidents recently where these cables have been damaged or severed. What is going on there?
Yeah, so over the past year, maybe a little longer than a year now, we've seen an alarming number of incidents involving damaged undersea cables in key regions like the Baltic Sea, off the coast of Norway, and also near Taiwan. Now, in many of these cases, Chinese or Russian ships have been spotted in the area before the damage occurred, and that raises serious suspicions of sabotage. Now, while some of these incidents are being labeled as accidents, the pattern is too consistent to ignore.
So, are we looking at deliberate acts of sabotage here? What do you think the motive is?
Look, it's to me highly likely that it's a deliberate act. And actually, I'm working on getting a friend of ours onto the podcast, Steve Laurie. Um, he actually led a team of analysts that uncovered a Chinese vessel working with Russian officials, implicating both in the deliberate cutting of a major undersea cable in the Baltic region.
That is a huge revelation.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. But what's more interesting about that is that their work, and it was actually their product that was put out that forced China to admit they cut the cable. Though, of course, China stopped short of admitting that it was actually deliberate.
Classic move, China.
Yeah, absolutely. But this is all part of a larger strategy of what you mentioned, gray warfare. It's a mix of military and non-military tactics designed to destabilize or weaken an opponent without triggering an outright war. And here's where it gets even more concerning. Both Russia and China are heavily invested in this.
So, they're essentially rewriting the rules of conflict.
Yeah, they absolutely. And they have been for a few years now. Now, for Russia, it's an extension of their longstanding use of unconventional tactics to undermine Western democracies. But for China, it's about asserting dominance in contested regions like the Taiwanese Strait and sending a clear message to the West about Chinese capabilities. So it's a calculated, strategic way to push boundaries without crossing the line into open conflict.
So, how serious is this threat?
Incredibly serious. Damaging undersea cables can have a catastrophic consequence. We're talking about potential internet blackouts, disruption to financial markets, and even impacts on military operations. And because these cables are co-owned by multiple countries and companies, it's difficult to assign blame or take decisive action. Now, this shared infrastructure creates shared vulnerabilities, which adversaries like Russia and China are exploiting.
So, what do you think can be done to counter this threat? Are there any steps being taken, especially since Russia and China are starting to do this a lot?
Yeah, there are some efforts underway. NATO, for example, launched an initiative called Baltic Sentry that increases patrols and surveillance of critical infrastructure in the Baltic Sea. They're deploying frigates, patrol aircraft, and naval drones to monitor these areas. But the challenge is that protecting undersea cables is incredibly resource intensive. It's not just about patrolling the surface. You also need to have advanced technology to monitor what's actually happening on the seabed.
I was about to say they're called undersea cables. So, what
Yeah,
is a flying drone going to do? Shouldn't they have like submersibles or submarines or some sort of underwater craft that can monitor what's going on down there?
absolutely. They definitely should.
Okay, so what about the broader response? Are democracies doing enough to address this?
No, not yet. That's that's really the significant concern. Right now, the response has been fragmented, I would say at best. Experts are warning that a lack of coordination is leaving critical infrastructure vulnerable globally. Now, what's really needed is a unified global effort to deter future sabotage attempts.
And what do you think that kind of response would look like?
Well, look, for starters, it could involve better offshore and satellite monitoring to track suspicious activity around undersea cables. Think of it as creating a kind of early warning system for potential threats. Now, on top of that, there is a growing call for stronger international agreements, essentially treaties, or some people call them frameworks, and they specifically protect undersea infrastructure.
Okay, but wouldn't enforcement of those agreements be a challenge?
Yeah, that's true. Enforcement's always tricky, especially on a global scale. And that's especially true when you're dealing with actors like Russia and China. They're very skilled at operating in the gray zone. I will say this, though. I'm getting very tired of governments saying, this is too difficult. I can't do it. It costs too much. So we're not going to fix it. There are absolutely things that can be done, like ramping up cybersecurity defenses. That would allow for the systems connected to these cables to see what's actually going on. They can also deploy naval assets to patrol high risk areas. They could even impose economic consequences for nations that are caught red handed in engaging in these types of sabotage.
Are you talking about sanctions?
No, my goodness. I'm sorry. I said the S word. I
You
hate
didn't
myself.
say that. You didn't say the S word. You just used
Roundabout
different-
way.
Yeah, you said it roundabout. Okay, so it's not just about reacting to incidents. It's obviously about preventing them in the first place.
Yeah, what I would say, stop reacting to events and be proactive about it. That's really the key here. I also say that inaction is only going to embolden Russia and China to continue these disruptive operations. So, what I'm saying here is the longer governments wait to address this, the more these adversaries are going to push the boundaries. And let's not forget, we're not just talking about undersea cables. We're talking about the message that it sends. So if they can disrupt something as critical as global communication infrastructure without facing serious consequences, what's going to stop them from escalating further?
Well, that is a really scary thought, especially with a possible global conflict looming. So let's table this discussion for now and get into the escalating tensions surrounding the U.S. immigration policy under President Trump, who has been back in office for just over a week. Can you believe it? It's only been about a week.
Feels like a year.
It's wild. Okay, so his administration has already implemented sweeping measures to crack down on illegal immigration, including the use of military aircraft for deportations and threats of tariffs and sanctions on countries that refuse to cooperate. And as we discussed last week, the designation of cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. All right, Kervin, let's start with the big picture here. What is the significance of these moves and how do they fit into the broader global order?
Well, I would say the significance lies in their dual purpose: addressing domestic concerns while signaling a shift in U.S. foreign policy priorities. Let's start with domestically. The aggressive stance on immigration, including military involvement and expedited deportations, is designed to project strength and fulfill campaign promises. Once again, going back to Trump was elected for specific reasons. I will say, though, on the global stage, these actions ripple outside of the United States. So, threatening tariffs and sanctions on uncooperative nations like Colombia, that ties immigration enforcement to economic and diplomatic leverage. And that could strain relationships with key partners in Latin America and beyond. These measures also send a clear message to our allies in the United States, as well as the adversaries. The U.S. is willing to act unilaterally and assertively to protect its perceived national interests, even if it disrupts the existing global order.
Okay, well, let's shift gears a bit. You've outlined some of the risks and challenges, but what about alternative solutions? Are there other ways to address these issues without resorting to such aggressive and intrusive measures?
Yeah, well, you're exactly right. And the first thing I want to say is the crisis at the border, as we've said multiple times, and we both agree on this, it is absolutely a crisis. And it's been a crisis for decades. This didn't happen in a vacuum, and it didn't just start during the Biden administration. I think we should stop that conversation right there. This isn't a Joe Biden problem. So sometimes extreme situations call for extreme measures. So while it may look to some like it's overreach by the Trump administration, we've got to understand he was elected with this particular problem as one of the American people's top concerns. I will say you are absolutely correct to ask if maybe, hey, could there be some alternatives to these extreme measures? And one alternative is to focus on addressing the root causes of migration. That would mean investing in economic development, security, and governance in the countries where most of the migrants are coming from. If people have opportunities and they feel safe in their home countries, they're less likely to leave those countries. This is logic. I mean, I think everybody can agree on that. Now, those countries need to be doing that. But I also think that the U.S. should absolutely support those efforts from a foreign policy perspective.
Okay, well, has that approach ever been tried before?
Yeah, I mean, it has. But look, this is what happens. It gets tried in a piecemeal or underfunded way. What needs to happen is a sustained, comprehensive effort that involves it's not the United States. I'm not just talking about the US doing all of this. It's also international organizations, private sector partners, and then regional governments that need to be part of this. It is a long-term strategy, but it is the only way to create lasting change.
I guess there's no money in having a stable government, though.
I mean, that could be a whole different podcast, right? So yes.
Okay.
What?
Okay. So, what about the enforcement side? Are there smarter ways to handle immigration enforcement?
Yeah, there really are. I mean, one option is to invest in technology and infrastructure at the border.
Okay, stop.
And
All right, stop. They aren't going to do that because that costs money that they aren't willing to spend. Okay.
it goes back to the wall, right?
It-
We wanted to
it-
build the wall. That's not good. Don't build the wall.
I'm just saying, like, our government seems completely adverse to spending money on things that would actually help. They'd rather just keep everything in place that we've had since like the Cold War.
Breach.
and and they and then whenever it fails, they blame the people for it. They're like, "Oh, there's too many people coming. We're overrun at the border. We can't fix it. We have other things, but we're sending money all over the place." Okay, I don't know where I'm trying to go with this.
Well,
I just know that it's not.
You want me to come up with with a different option?
Yeah.
That would probably cost less money, is what I'm hearing you say. And I think one of those options is to streamline legal immigration systems.
Stop making it so difficult to. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So I know some people are screaming, but it's so easy to cross the border. It is very difficult to legally get into this country through official channels.
And expensive.
Yes, the cartels have made it super easy to get
I
to
wouldn't.
the border in unofficial channels.
I wouldn't say it's super easy. These people are still putting their lives at risk trying to cross over the
So when I
border.
say super easy, I mean there are gaps in security in certain locations, and there were tunnels that have been built in those locations in order to cross the border. And the cartels receive money from families who want to cross over,
taking advantage of people who are in desperate situations. Right.
Just want to be safe.
Right. And opportunities and to feed their families and to not be worried if they're going to get,
And what does this lead to? Those smuggling networks and human trafficking. And that has got to stop. And the U.S. and Mexico, for example, need to crack down on that.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not just about cracking down, though. It's about creating a more efficient and humane system.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. The current approach is heavily focused on deterrence. But with like we've seen with China and U.S. saying we want to deter China from doing what we know they're going to do with Taiwan, it doesn't solve the problem. There's got to be a balanced strategy that combines enforcement with diplomacy, development, and legal reform. Otherwise, you're just treating the symptoms without addressing the underlying causes.
That sounds like our medical care.
As we're watching House these days.
As we're watching House, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and much like in medicine, you and I both know that treating the symptoms without addressing the root causes is not an actual solution.
It might lead to the death of someone.
Yeah, okay.
Don't get me started.
Well, we have had a lot of not so great interactions with. Okay, never mind.
Yeah.
Everybody's heard us complain about this stuff before. I feel like we complain a lot. Sorry.
That's what they keep coming back for.
They love to hear us whine and moan from our
two idiots complaining about today.
Yeah, what is going on?
It should be a daily podcast called The Complainers.
Well, no, we got to come up with something more clever than that. The Complainers. Come on, man. You're better than this. Okay, so as we wrap up, what is the most important takeaway you think policymakers should keep in mind as they tackle these complex challenges?
I think it's twofold. It's strategic. They need to have strategic thoughts, but also long term. A lot of what happens in the government, let me bring COVID back into it, right? We think a lot in the moment. So we do 2 weeks to flatten the curve. That 2 weeks turns into a year, turns into 2 years, because we're not trying to fix the situation. We're just thinking about the present day and nothing gets fixed. Immigration is a global challenge. That requires global solutions. These heavy-handed tactics, they're going to score political points in the short term for Donald Trump, but they're going to also create bigger problems down the road. I think policymakers need to focus on building partnerships, addressing the root causes, and creating systems that are both effective and sustainable. Anything less risks perpetuating the cycle of instability and migration.
Absolutely. Do you have anything else you want to add before we close out?
I don't have anything. Do you want to talk about anything, just the two of us? With thousands of other people listen.
No.
Nope.
I get in my head. See, whenever you bring that up, whenever I'm reminded that this is actually being made to be sent out to thousands of listeners, that's when I get in my head and I have trouble composing my thoughts into like a stream of consciousness that makes sense. And then that's when my brain starts getting all fuzzy and I can't, my power of recall just completely dissipates. I can't come up with the word that I'm trying to think of. And see, that's my problem. That's what happens is whenever I'm reminded, I get in my head and I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to try to sound smart or try to sound like I know what I'm talking about. And then everything turns off and it takes me a lot more than you would think. It takes a lot of tries to get through these. I'm sure people aren't surprised.
No. It's like, oh, there's a little inside baseball there. Before we start the podcast, I tell Tiana, no, this isn't getting released. We're just going to have a conversation between the two of us. But now she knows it's going out to.
Oh, hush your mouth. Like, that's not even true. He's just making crap up now.
Okay, you got anything you want to talk?
No. I think I'm done. And also, people are already aware that most of the time I don't even know what I'm talking about. I'm just saying things.
So that was a very famous line from the commander in Yemen, who would always tell me, "All stop, Kervin."
Why was he saying that to you?
Because of the ridiculous stuff that I would typically say, things like I would say to you on a day-to-day basis.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to start saying that if it shuts you up, for sure.
All stop, which is a naval term that they use on the ship, meaning everything stops, comes to a halt because, something's happening.
I think I remember that in The Hunt for Red October.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so nothing else to say.
No, all stop.
Okay. Thank you so much for listening to this tiny little independent geopolitical podcast. We hope you found it both informative and engaging. And if you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, please let us know. If you want in-depth coverage of these stories and more, follow us on Instagram at Oakwood Analytics.
Tiana, thank you so much. And until next week, stay safe out there.
This podcast is a production of Unfiltered Studios. If you would like to know more about joining Unfiltered Studios, please visit our website at unfpod.com for more information.